hello and welcome everyone to Inside the Publisher Lab. So for those of you who are just joining us, Shelby and I record a weekly podcast called The Publisher Lab, and this is called Inside the Publisher Lab, which is we record a video right after the Publisher Lab podcast, and we're going to zero in on one particular topic that we talked about on the podcast and kind of go into a little bit more depth. And so in this case, Shelby, the topic that we discussed that I thought was really interesting today was something the New York Times was doing. So what was the New York Times doing exactly?
Yeah, so the New York Times is launching a limited edition international newsletter. It's basically focused around the midterm elections and kind of demystifying some political things going around. And it's actually for UK readers. But the cool thing about it is that it just pretty much runs for the duration of now up until the election goes.
Yeah, so this is an interesting new concept where publishers are essentially kind of honing in on a topic they think may be meaningful to a particular subsection of their audience and creating some very particular, a very particular type of content and marketing it towards them. In this case, they're doing it through a newsletter, but they could really do this through a lot of different types of platforms, couldn't they?
Yeah, if you wanted to post on social about it, if you wanted to do like a weekly live stream based on like some sort of topic, that's definitely a lot of directions you could run with it.
Yeah, and so one of the things we've talked about a lot recently on the Publisher Lab is being able to kind of maybe take advantage of emerging platforms and connecting with different subsections of your audience. So if you're a publisher right now, there's a good chance that your existing audience in some way has some kind of overlapping interest in another form of content that you could maybe tap into. And instead of just creating like another website or blog or something like that, you could essentially launch this new idea on a platform like Instagram or Instagram Stories or Facebook Watch. And these are just video examples, but we've seen some examples here recently of people hopping into something like Facebook Watch to create a new form of content to essentially create a new brand, right?
Right, definitely. It can be taken a lot of different directions. If you're a baking blog, let's say, or a baking website, and you're posting recipes, you could do a newsletter about just cupcake recipes, just cake recipes, and people can opt in. Or you could do like a series of short videos on Instagram, whether it be on your feed itself or on your story, and just do a series of 6 cupcake recipes just for Halloween, let's say. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of choose a specific season, a specific event, or a specific audience and kind of cater that content towards that.
And one thing I really liked that you talked about on the podcast was actually, you mentioned football season. So we are in the fall here in the United States. This is American football season. And so I've seen already some publishers that are doing this, but they've created either specific shows or specific types of content that are centered around to take advantage of kind of maybe the enthusiasm, their excitement around something like this. And, I think this is the idea behind the New York Times doing something like these temporary newsletters where, when you have like a big newsletter list, one of the things they always teach you in marketing school, just kidding, but they will always talk about how really broad lists, you burn up unsubscribes and people will start to kind of have like blindness in their email inbox to your emails if you start marketing to really broad lists. But the more kind of segmented you can get the list, the higher your open rates are going to be, the higher your click-through rates are going to be. But over time, almost all email lists kind of degrade in their quality. And so by doing kind of these short-term lists, you don't burn up your audience. You can kind of maybe create a greater level of engagement, and you can kind of like tap into all these different kind of like short-term bursts of content. I talk to publishers all the time. They say, we're running out of ideas. Essentially, you're unlimited in your ideas if you can find different ways to connect with your audience, right?
Yeah, and it's also a good way to kind of like read your audience, what they're reacting to, what they like. So you can kind of leverage that when you're thinking about new content.
And our good friend Paul Kassar talked about this in his talk at Pubtelligence, and I think he maybe mentioned it on our podcast a couple weeks ago. Paul was the CDO at Hearst Publications for a long period of time, and he mentioned that one of the things that Better Home & Garden had done was they capitalized on some content that was themed around Game of Thrones. And so you might say to yourself, what does Better Home & Garden have to do with Game of Thrones? Why would this audience find any kind of like overlap in in theme with something like this. But the truth is they did, and they found that was something that created a lot of engagement. When Game of Thrones launched their newest season, a couple years ago, it was like all the rage, and so they capitalized on that event, even though their specific kind of niche in publishing didn't really have anything to do with that. And I think that as publishers, it's really good to think maybe creatively outside the box like that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so I think that's probably the theme, and the reason why we picked this topic on Inside the Publisher Lab is it's one of the things we constantly are espousing, which is find new ways to connect with your audience, try different things. We mentioned it on the podcast, I'll mention it here again, which is don't be afraid to take risks. The greatest threat that your publishing business has is the fact that you would potentially do nothing. So try new emerging technologies and try to find new ways to interact and engage with your audience, right, Shelby?
Absolutely.
Thank you guys for joining us on Inside the Publisher Lab.